Hi, this is going to be my analysis video for the analysis paper. My paper was over scene safety and awareness in EMS. I think it's often an overlooked skill, and it degrades if you don't practice it, just like any other skill within EMS. So, sizing up a scene is one of the most important, if not the most important part of an emergency response. Incorrectly assessing a scene or failing to notice a hazard could result in injuring or killing your patient, your partner, or you. Assessing a scene is a constant act that is done throughout the call, from the time you get dispatched to a call to the time you go available. You're always assessing a scene for hazards, mechanisms of injury, and multiple other things. There will be multiple things that will be discussed within this analysis related to scene size up. So I think personally in school, sizing up a scene is overlooked and not practiced enough, because in scenarios, whenever you're just walking onto the scenario at the beginning, it's 2 lines of saying scene safe, and you just go on the scenario as if nothing's going to change, because nothing ever really does change in a scenario, and I think that needs to be more dynamic, and my paper goes into that in a little more detail. Traditionally in school, sizing up a scene is something that's looked over. In scenarios, there isn't much to assess beyond mechanisms of injury, and beyond that, there is no reason to assess the scene, as much scenarios end up not being nearly as dynamic as in the real world. Most students just announce BSI, scene safe, and imagine that their scene is safe and will be for the duration of the scenario, which is far from the truth. Most scenarios also leave out things such as weather, distance from the call, bystanders, time of day, and multiple other factors that play into assessing a scene appropriately. This leads to first responders not being competent at assessing a scene in real-world emergency. Having first responders that are not adequately assessing scenes could result in more injuries to bystanders, other responders, or further injury to the patient or patients. So, traditionally, there's not any hazards in a scenario in school. So within a scenario in school, I think that there needs to be more practice in dynamic changes in the scenario, such as bystanders or simulated vehicles going through the scene, because in real life, if you pull up on an MVA on the side of the highway, there's a pretty good chance somebody is distracted by the lights and sirens and vehicles and could potentially go through the scene, and you need to be assessing that constantly. Scenarios in a training environment should ideally practice assessing a scene with the student being dispatched, checking the scene from afar before arriving, and assessing the scene upon arrival. There should also be a dynamic change to the scenario throughout, testing the student to see if they are constantly sizing up the scene. So what I mean by that is, I think there should be more focus on when you're pulling up to a scene and you look out the windshield, you can gain a lot of information just by looking at the scene from a distance while still inside the ambulance. You can see potential hazards if it's an assault. You can see if there's an assailant still there. You can see if there's any fires from a violent MVA, things of that nature. And by dynamic changes to the scenario throughout, you can be testing the student during the scenarios and seeing how he reacts, as if he's going to leave the scene, call PD for a scenario, or if he's able to deal with it himself. Once being dispatched to the call, the responder must think, where is that address? How far is it from where we currently are? Estimating the time it will take you to arrive on scene will help determine what could be different from when the call is dispatched to when responders arrive on scene. So, if you take 10 minutes to get to a scene and it was a breathing problem, was the chief complaint over the radio, That patient could be in respiratory arrest by the time you arrive, and you need to be ready for that, because if you're expecting to walk in and see somebody in the tripod position when they called 10 minutes ago, and they could have been at the end stage of respiratory distress, you're not going to be prepared mentally for what you're about to deal with. In major trauma, if it takes 10 minutes to arrive on scene, the patient can lose a significant amount of blood before any meaningful intervention has been performed. If a patient calls 911 for trouble breathing and it takes 15 minutes for the closest responder to arrive, the patient could be in respiratory arrest before any care is administered. En route to the call, weather should also be a factor in assessing a scene. If it's too cold, what is the temperature? If the patient's outside, the patient could develop hypothermia along with the original complaint. Is it raining or snowing? These could be potential hazards depending on the severity. And if responding to a motor vehicle collision on a roadway, other motorists could be a potential hazard and could collide with the parked ambulance on the side of the road or even hit the responders and patient. The time of day in which the emergency occurs plays a factor as well. If it's dark out, you may need to bring flashlights to the scene, or you might need to watch out for other motorists if the emergency is on the road. Staying aware of these environmental hazards will help decrease accidents and injuries during emergencies. So, the thing about the weather is if you have a patient that wandered a mile into the woods and got lost and called 911 because he's suffering from hypothermia and frostbite, and you go out there wearing a long sleeve shirt and you have to sit there and find this guy, you could develop hypothermia yourself. Now you got two patients, and you being the paramedic, you're gonna have to call another ambulance, and you're using up resources, you're not prepared, and you're injuring yourself, and you're causing more damage to the patient by putting yourself out of service. So you always have to be prepared. If it's cold outside, you need to have extra cold weather gear. You need to watch out for hazards like snow or rain, because you'll be on the side of the road dealing with the MVC, and if you're not constantly aware, some other bystander could just run right through the scene. Arriving on the scene to a call, the scene should be assessed from inside the ambulance. Where should the ambulance be parked? Are there any environmental hazards on scene? Is there a need for additional resources or hazmat? Staying inside the ambulance and assessing the scene before stepping out is a good way to avoid getting involved with an unsafe scene, such as an attacker that has not left the scene yet, or toxic fumes spreading over the scene from an overturned tanker. I saw a video recently of a police officer responding to an accident that involved a tanker, and he saw that the patient was unconscious in the vehicle. He got out to go help him, got overwhelmed by the fumes coming from the tanker, and he died as a result. So, appropriately sizing up the scene from inside the ambulance is important, because getting out, if you didn't assess it before you got out, it's too late. Once on scene, it is important to establish the mechanism of injury and the number of patients. Failing to notice a critical patient in the back of a smashed vehicle can and will result in a patient's death. Once you have determined the number of patients on scene, you can decide the amount of resources you will need to call for it, if any. While providing care to the patients, it is important to maintain constant awareness. The scene is dynamic, anything from a stray dog wandering on scene to a motorist driving through the scene. There may be many things that can be caught early and avoided if a constant assessment is being done. During transport, while assessing the patient in the back of the ambulance, one would think that there is no reason to be assessing the environment. Assessing the immediate area is still important, as family members that are with the patient can affect patient care, or patient belongings can give clues to the patient's illness. The partner should also be assessing the roadway throughout transport for other motorists, curbs, lights, and the weather. These things can hinder transport of a critical patient, and failing to notice a bump in the road while driving could interrupt patient care in the back. So if you're driving like a madman and hit curbs and driving to oncoming, swerving to miss people, there's no way the paramedic in the back can care for a patient effectively because he's having to hold on to not fall. Overall, scene safety is a subject that should be constantly assessed. The time that the scene is not assessed is the time that an accident will happen. And staying aware of hazards will help to prevent further patients and reduce the risk of injury to the providers. While not everything can be avoided, things that can be are things that should not trouble a provider who is aware and assessing a scene constantly. And that's my video.